Hi, hello, B, lullaby, whatever the fuck y'all are calling me these days here. So earlier today, I made a post on Threads talking about how fascinated I am by the disinformation campaign around Hyunlix, specifically the idea that Hyunlix stopped interacting as much on camera because either they were uncomfortable with shippers or because skijigi made them, and how I think that it's like a truly fascinating disinformation campaign that like deserves to be studied, frankly. And a lot of people either didn't know what I was talking about, and if you're one of those people, I will explain it a little bit in a moment once I've done the setup of what's happening here. Or were kind of shocked or surprised about like how effective the disinformation and misinformation around it actually is. And I sort of put out the question of if people would be interested in a video of me explaining how disinformation campaigns work. And a number of people were. So I have taken us to one of my favorite places in Seattle. Unfortunately, I couldn't set up the camera to get the wonderful mountain view, but I have a wonderful mountain view. Love that for me. And I'm going to fix my fucked up nails and talk about disinformation. This is very off the cuff. I don't have a functioning computer right now, so I can't do any of my like other content stuff. And I wasn't going to plan this out. This is just me chatting into the void. So I don't really know how long this is going to be. It's a really interesting topic that I wouldn't say I don't necessarily have academic experience in the topic of disinformation. It's just something I'm really, really interested in because of my personal background in games and politics. So the way I'm going to try to set this up, the beginning to the end, is first I'm going to give a quick overview of the Hyunlix situation for y'all. Just so that you're not freaking out, going, but what was happening there? This video is not going to be very much about Hyunlix. At some point, I will make a podcast episode about Hyunlix, but I also recognize that that episode is like the most likely thing to get me canceled. So I'm putting that way off into the future. But at no point do I want to make it seem like I'm putting down any strong sides to any debates or anything. This is meant to be a video about disinformation, and it just so happens that there is a disinformation campaign around Hyunlix. So I'll explain that a little bit. I'm not going to go in depth. And then I'm going to talk about what is disinformation, how does it differ from misinformation. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of online disinformation specifically, because it's a very different world online than it is offline. And I'm going to be honest, I don't have as much like academic knowledge or theory about offline disinformation campaigns. That's a very, very old practice that has a lot of nuance around it, and I'm not an expert in that field by any means. But I'll talk a little bit about the history of online disinformation. And then I will talk a little bit about, like, with the context of that history, with overall context, how do disinformation campaigns happen? How are they effective? What perpetuates them? And then how you can sort of protect yourself from disinformation. That latter bit is going to be pretty straightforward, because I think that knowing and understanding how disinformation campaigns work is the number one thing you need in order to protect yourself from disinformation campaigns. So like a lot of that will have already been done in the first part of the video. Okay, so that's my setup. Let's talk about Hyunlix and what I mean by a disinformation campaign around Hyunlix. So now I want to make it clear, I was not a stay back in 2023. I've only been a stay since like mid to late 2024. I just happen to be obsessive and know a lot and do a lot of research about everything, especially my special interests. So the common narrative that you will see around Hyunlix, first of all, is the narrative that they don't interact much anymore. And that with this tour, the interaction has picked up. That's like true adjacent. There's definitely been a decrease of interaction. I don't think the decrease was as harsh or hard as people think it was, though. Which again, this is like, all of this is part of the disinformation campaign, so just keep that in mind. And I know that the interaction tail off wasn't as harsh or hard as people think it is, because whenever you try to figure out, like, well, when did it happen that they stopped interacting so much, you sort of get a different answer. Some people say it was like towards the tail end of the Maniac tour, which we'll get to in a moment. Would make sense. Everybody seems to agree that like the first half of 2024 was very low on Hyunlix interaction. Sure, okay. So some people will say 2023, some people will say 2022, some people will say after Hyunjin's hiatus in 2021. I have a suspicion that all of those things are true, and I have a suspicion that all of those things are true for more than just them, right? Because there's a lot of factors as to why we see things changing on camera over time. If you listen to my podcast, you will recall that my latest episode, I sort of put down a number of theories about how, like, what the expectations, what the neuro expectations that Stay have towards Stray Kids, and sometimes towards K-pop in general. And one of those is the expectation that, like, they stay the same because we experience content much faster in time than, so rather, back up, because all of their content from all of their lives is available to us immediately, right? We can go back and experience them at any age, at any time. And in that way, they sort of exist at a perpetual age for us. And so while most people change dramatically, especially over the course of between, 16 and 25, whatever, honestly, 16 to 30, like, who the fuck knows who you're going to be in a year. But because people change really dramatically during that time, we're used to seeing that in people over time, but we see it on camera much, much faster in some ways. And we can always go back, which, like, you normally can't do with just your friends. So there's a lot of reasons why interactions are going to change over time. But that nuance, not helpful in a disinformation campaign, so it sort of goes away. Sometimes people will bring up some of them, but even then it exists very much as a, well, they just grew up sort of thing, and like that's also not helpful. Any specific narrative that is really strongly this, or this is probably not the case. Now, to be clear, we don't know why their interactions changed. We don't know that for certain. There are very, very few, like, they've never said anything about it. As far as I'm aware, no one's ever really said anything about it. I saw a couple comments once that said that in Chan's room, he brought up that they're, like, still really close. I don't even know if that's true, though, because I haven't watched all of Chan's room. So we have not been told factual information about why their interactions changed. What you see a lot of on social media is one of two things, right? It's either one, shippers made them uncomfortable, or two, skijigi forcibly separated them because they were, like, too gay or something. Now, neither of these really pan out as logical. You know, the former doesn't really pan out as logical, because if that were the case, they probably wouldn't have increased their interactions. There's a plane flying by. I'm really sorry if it's loud. We're just gonna have to cope with that reality, actually. I live 10 miles from an airport. There's nothing I can do about this, okay? Doesn't matter that I'm in a really nice, quiet park. I'm still in the middle of a goddamn city. Yeah, it doesn't really pan out like the first one, because if it were shippers making them uncomfortable, first of all, like, Chan probably would have said something at some point, or like alluded to something. They've gotten much better at putting down boundaries, but like they have in the past for various reasons before. And it doesn't really make much sense that they would have increased their interactions. You know, there's the possibility that like it did make them uncomfortable, and then they like focused on their relationship and learned to tune out some of the noise, and are okay with it now. That's totally possible. That one is not fully like off the table. It's not completely unreasonable, but we don't know. We don't know that. And the second one, there's a lot of edits, sure, of like they looked at skijigi and then they did this and whatever. It doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. One, K-pop thrives on fan service. Like, it's a fundamental part of marketing, right? Two, like, it doesn't make sense that skijigi would be anti-Hyunlix, but like okay with Minsung being Minsung. Three, part of the narrative, and this is also part of the disinformation campaign, is that Hyunlix was like a massive ship. My understanding, based on people who were kind of in that shipping community at the time, as well as based on watching old content and reading old comments on that content, is that, and yeah, like, yes, I've obviously done a lot of research into this, and that's because this is fascinating to me. Like, this entire thing is fascinating to me. It does not seem like Hyunlix was actually that big of a ship. You look at 2020, 2021, it really doesn't seem that way. It probably took off a little bit at the beginning of 2022 with the 2 kids room. Like, that does seem to be the trajectory, but like, this was not a problem in 2020, 2021, really. You didn't get the same type of content. There was not nearly as much like Hyunlix content at that point, and we'll get to what like might have sort of happened there, and how that changed. So those 2 reasons don't necessarily pan out. And also generally, if something is being stated hard and fast as this is the reason why, and there is one reason why, it's probably more complex than that. It's probably more complicated than that. So what a lot of people don't realize, which is, some people get really, really shocked that a lot of people don't know this. So if you know this, great. You should know a lot of people do not know this. Hyunlix, both Hyunjin and Felix started getting quite a number of death threats in 2023. Throughout 2023, there's even a couple at the beginning of 2024. Stray Kids themselves have been getting death threats that we know about since like at least 2022. There was a situation with the Oakland stop during the Maniac tour where there had to be increased police presence. This tracks logically, logistically, you know, as people get more famous, they are more prone to death threats. But this is also something that happens in fandom culture. We will talk more about fandom culture as we talk about the history of online disinformation. We definitely do not know the scope of the type of threats that Stray Kids has gotten, etc. We probably never will. Maybe at some point we will gain more information about it, but you do not understand how many death threats famous artists get. We can talk about, say, like Laura Bailey. So Laura Bailey is a voice actress. She voiced Abby in Last of Us 2. Because Abby was seen as a villain, Laura started to get death threats against her husband, her child. They had to do serious protection and investigation, and nobody knew anything about this until quite a bit later when Laura did an interview about this, right? It's generally not a great idea for artists to put out information about the death threats that they're getting if they have access to security. That's something that can be worth doing if you are an individual who does not have access to resources and protection. But if you're somebody who has access to resources and protection, you don't advertise the threats you get, because that's going to make them worse very often. It's actually much more dangerous to let people know all the information you have. The threats that we know about. Now, there were a few threats that were sort of separate, but we do know that there were some at least decently credible public threats that were specifically targeting either Hyunjin or Felix, usually Felix, for being too close to Hyunjin. There was one that was written that was quite unnerving. There were incidents with lasers. There was one particularly bad laser incident, I want to say mid 2023, and I think again in 2024. We don't know how many of those threats were, we don't know how many of those threats there were. We don't know how many of them were credible. We don't know really how many of them were targeting them as individuals from outcasts, from antis, etc., and how many of them were because of this feeling that this person was going to take away your idol, the solo stands and that guys and things like that. But it is very likely that because honestly, it would only take one death threat. If I were really close to somebody, doesn't matter what my relationship with them was, how we defined it, what we said it was, and I think you'd probably agree. Think about some of the most important people in your life, right? Think about some of the most important people in your life, doesn't matter what type of relationship it is. If you were a public figure and you got even one threat that was I'm going to kill that person because you two love each other, I'd stop. I wouldn't need fucking anybody to tell me to stop. Right? I'd be like, oh, I'm never hugging this person publicly again. Now, there were some rational reasons to say that doesn't necessarily pan out too. Why would they have increased their interactions if that were the case? Could be changes in security. It could be that it's been long enough and they have enough fame now that they're hopeful that would be protective for them. It could be that despite reducing interactions, they still were getting death threats for similar things, and we're well, then fuck it. If people are going to be like this no matter what we do, then we're just going to do whatever we want to do. So that's sort of the whole, that's a greater context. There's a lot of nuance to that conversation. There's like I said, at some point I'll do a podcast episode on the Hyunlix storyline as well as the complications there. But those are the nuances of that one. The disinformation campaign was specifically trying to make the information about the very rational reasons they would have reduced interaction go away, because what focusing on that would focus on the deep fundamental issues in the fandom itself, right? And it also would result in a lot of conversation about, like, whether it's useful to be really hardcore anti, how ag guys are created and perpetuated. It would put the spotlight on the people who don't want the spotlight put on them, right? So the disinformation campaign begins at the people doing the harm. So let's back up a little bit, and I'm going to talk about what disinformation is and what misinformation is, and sort of the purposes and goals of these things. And I'm realizing I said I was going to do my nails, and I'm not. I'm just talking with my hands. So I guess I'll sit here and try to fix that. So disinformation is a purposeful thing. Disinformation is similar to propaganda. It's kind of, it utilizes propaganda, and it is done for the purpose of kind of mass cultural untruths, right? It's done for the purpose of convincing large groups of people to believe something that is beneficial for the agenda of those perpetuating the disinformation. So it's different from misinformation, and that misinformation is essentially being wrong. Like, you understood something incorrectly, or you were told something wrong, and you got it wrong. It is you were lied to, or something like that, and the perpetuation is just not knowing the truth. Disinformation campaigns rely on misinformation, right? They rely on people perpetuating the incorrect information and believing it to be true. So disinformation campaigns basically rope people into believing in the disinformation, so that it becomes ongoing misinformation that self-perpetuates. That's the ultimate goal, is to make the new narrative essentially truth, even if it is unfactual. So a lot of the times we see disinformation campaigns in politics. Those are going to be the most, like, referenced disinformation campaigns, with a couple of exceptions that I'll talk about. Like I said, disinformation has a very, very long history. It's been around for as long as there have been wars, right? It is a form of manipulation that just has always been really helpful and beneficial to people perpetuating it. So we see it a lot in politics. Those are going to be some of our most referenced disinformation campaigns. Russia is known for being one of the most effective countries at disinformation in the world, right? They have a lot of people dedicated to it. It is very, very good disinformation. They know what they're doing. And we'll get to that in a moment as we're talking about some of the history of online disinformation. The internet was always going to be a powerful tool for disinformation. People didn't really learn how to utilize it the most effectively, though, until about 2013. So, like I said, it was always going to be an effective tool for this. It's just that people had to figure out how. What is the method by which we perpetuate disinformation online versus offline? And now it is arguably the most effective tool for disinformation, to a horrifying degree. it's really, truly terrifying. If you exist in, especially in, I think that any side of the kind of authoritarian political spectrum, whether it's the authoritarian left or the authoritarian right, is like completely relies on disinformation. And this is really frightening for society. Sort of a different matter. The other place where we see a lot of disinformation is fandoms. Now, why is it kind of politics and fandoms? Well, health is also in there, but health is usually related to politics. Like, there's usually a political reason why there are health-related disinformation campaigns. But fandom, so why is fandom such a big place for disinformation? I don't really know. My guess, like from a clinical perspective, would be that it has to do with the way that we personally identify with fandom. Fandom is very, very, like, we really integrate it into some of the core of who we are. And so when that feels attacked, if people don't have a really strong internal sense of self, which a lot of people don't, I argue as a therapist, our number one job usually is building a sense of self. I sometimes get clients who have really strong senses of selves already, but a lot of times that's not the case. And it is especially true for young people, right? When you're sort of still building your sense of self until you're like in your early 20s. It sort of changes between person to person exactly when, but early 20s is when that, like, in a healthy development, that's going to super solidify. So, young people especially become super fucking attached to fandom, and it's very easy to exploit. It's very, very easy to exploit that. And people do. So we have to talk about Gamergate. In order to talk about the history of online disinformation, we have to talk about Gamergate. I'm so sorry. There's another plane. There's just ongoing planes. That's just what life is for me. It's distracting me though, so I'm... Right, Gamergate. Gamergate... Okay. So, games as an industry has been, historically, really toxic to anyone who is not a cishet white dude. This is not as true anymore, but historically it has been extremely true. And there have been a lot of attempts to keep it that way. Now, all things have catalysts. The internet was never a super great place to be a young marginalized person who interacted with the games community. Right? It was never like... League of Legends was universally known for being the worst place for a marginalized person to exist on. The whole, like, gamer girl stereotype that was super misogynistic was really, really common. There was a lot of hatred towards female streamers. It was just not a good place for women, and especially otherwise marginalized women. So I want to say it was like 2012-ish that Anita Sarkeesian came onto the scene. basically, a woman who I've actually had the joy of meeting before, which was wonderful. She was a friend of one of my coworkers when I worked in games, and she came in and gave us sort of a talk and workshop, and that was a really great experience. But Anita started a YouTube series called Tropes in Games that was kind of like a long form talking about various tropes in games, but especially like some of the misogyny and things like that. Now, I can state fully, completely, 100%, talking about that was never a safe thing to do. I think a lot of people not in games or young people, you cannot fathom how bad it would get if you brought up sexism or rape culture in the games industry. I once did a presentation when I was getting my game design degree. I did a presentation on this, and this would have been in, I want to say 2012. I think it was a little bit after some of the Tropes and Games things was coming out. I did a presentation on rape culture and how online discourse really in games really perpetuates rape culture, and it was a low-key traumatizing presentation that I gave. There were people in the class trying to justify using slurs. There were people, and like the teacher tried to manage it, but even the teacher was like, yeah, but what would you say we should do about this? And this was a woman, right? Like, there were a lot of people just being silent. After the presentation, I got men coming up to me being like, I think that was a really great presentation, but they weren't saying jack shit. While I had like 3 or 4 people coming at me for like over exaggerating about when people would literally go online and say you should be raped. It was bad. It was really fucking bad. And it got a lot worse after the Tropes and Games thing, because that's what happens when you start speaking up about problems. People amp up the response and amp up the radicalization towards the other side. And they saw an opportunity with Zoe Quinn, who made the game Depression Quest. And the thing is that you don't find a singular opportunity. You try to grasp onto anything with disinformation campaigns. You try to find any narrative that people will hold on to, and then once you find the one that people do hold on to, you run with it. So Zoe had gotten a number of positive reviews for her game, and she had an ex who hated her. So I need you to understand that Donald Trump exists as president largely in part due to the fact that Zoe Quinn's ex wanted to ruin their life. Like, there's a direct line. So, went on 4chan and basically tried to figure out how to ruin Zoe's life. And what happened was something called ethics in games journalism, wherein they all started perpetuating this rumor that Zoe had slept with one of the people who wrote a positive review of Depression Quest. I'm gonna be straight up, I don't even remember if that was true or not. I don't think it was, but it also wasn't relevant. But they made this whole thing, it was hashtag ethics in games journalism. This was around 2013, 2014. And they perpetuated it, right? Oh, this isn't about misogyny, this is about ethics in games journalism. So Zoe would be like, I am being harassed by people because they are trying to put on a campaign of misogyny. And people would be like, no, it's about ethics and games journalism, right? So you redirect the attention because you want to keep the attention off the actual problem. And then you want to demonize the people who claim the actual problem is the problem, right? So, you know, you say, like, this is a problem of misogyny, and people go, like, you just freak out about everything, and you're trying to divert, like, they project that onto you. You're trying to divert attention away from the real problem, which is ethics and games journalism. Eventually, this rose to what was #NotYourShield, which is where marginalized people would say that I am #NotYourShield, right? So it was sort of an anti-feminism movement, and not just anti-feminism, but anti-racism. You know, the word anti-racism was not as popular on the internet at that point, but it was a similar sort of thing of, like, don't use my identities to justify, like, all of these things. I am not your shield, you know. And it was very much a kind of conservative movement that was built to be explicitly anti-feminist. These were all incredibly effective. Incredibly effective. And we partially know about how much this was an orchestrated disinformation event because we've gotten screenshots from 4chans, from secret chats, right? Like, just the same way. Espionage is always part of this from every side. And there was espionage involved that got us receipts to prove that this was an orchestrated disinformation campaign. You know, very recently it's come out that a huge number of email addresses from 4chan were .gov accounts, which is not surprising at all. 2014 was when Gamergate got really, really bad. Like 2013, 2014, really, really, really bad. It was really scary to be a vocal woman, especially like multiply marginalized woman or like marginalized gendered person on the internet at that point. Everyone was getting death threats. Everyone was getting rape threats. The people who were the most vocal just had so many people going out after them. If you know the concept of swatting, when you call a SWAT team on a streamer or on somebody, the swatting really came up at that time. A lot of people had to move their homes repeatedly. People stopped being able to vote because the voting records in their state are public, and they'd get doxxed constantly. You know, doxing has taken on sort of a weird meaning these days, in which, like, what doxing used to be was taking, yes, publicly available information, but taking often publicly available information, but making it very, very accessible and visible about their real life persona. And now the concept of doxing has sort of moved to, like, if you mention any of my existence, you're doxing me, which is, I think, undermines the severity of what doxing used to be, and what doxing often still is, right? People still do this. It was a very frightening time. Part of the reason I didn't go back to games, so like I left games to get a tech job after my like year-long contract ended, and I was like, oh, I'm not getting customer feedback on Reddit anymore. I'm not on these forums calling my boss a cunt or a bitch anymore. I'm not engrossed in this toxicity of why are we bringing politics into my video game. I'm not like it was so, it was suddenly not terrifying to simply exist. Now, what does this have to do with Donald Trump? What we know is that this was one of the first times that we saw a really, really effective disinformation campaign. And there are some very direct corollaries to that disinformation campaign and Russia learning how to do a really effective disinformation campaign online. And part of the reason we know this is because a lot of people who were involved in Donald Trump's first presidency were big names during Gamergate. A lot of people don't know this. Milo Yiannopoulos, whatever the fuck his name was, big name during Gamergate. Steve Bannon, one of the biggest names during Gamergate, right? A lot of the initial Trump presidency, those fuckwits who he put in charge of things, were the people who perpetuated disinformation campaigning the most during Gamergate. And we know that there was Russian interference and probably other interference and probably government interference and probably all kinds of interference, but we know there was disinformation interference in our first election, in this last election. Like, the amount of disinformation in politics these days is you cannot fathom. Unless, like, you are as in the disinformation world as I have been. Part of the reason I got really into K-pop and, like, stepped away from news is because it became so clear that it was so difficult to tell reality from fiction online, especially as things around Palestine and Iran were coming up. Jesus fucking Christ, the amount of disinformation about Iran and Palestine on the left, it's rough. Oh. What? Why is my cough drop? That cough drop is too old, I guess. Or maybe it got burned. I don't know. Looks gross. Looks like something's wrong with that cough drop. Not gonna use it. So, fandom disinformation, like, very explicitly, online at least, results in political disinformation online, historically. Obviously, like, it's more complex than that, you know, there's a lot more to it, but that's, like, some of our base premise of understanding how disinformation works in our modern era online. The other really important part of this is acknowledging, so at that time, you know, the people very much most online were millennials. And one of the biggest ways that this was dismissed was like, it's just online, just turn off your computer. In fact, police would say this to, you know, somebody would get the SWAT team called on them, they'd call the police and the police would be like, just turn off your computer. So there's this very millennial tendency, and like it comes from like a Gen X millennial mindset of the internet is not that real. Just walk away. So that gets leveraged. And then now there's the other side of the coin, which is the sort of young Gen Z and Gen Alpha, much more common perspective of the internet is the most real thing. Now, I'm not saying in any generation either of those are like everybody's ideas or things like that, but that is the cultural sort of generational nuance, and both of those get leveraged against us, right? It's because you can have people on one side going like, it's not that serious, you don't need to think about it this much, right? Like there's probably plenty of people who are watching what's going to end up being like an hour-long video, or seeing what's going to end up being an hour-long video on disinformation that starts with disinformation and Hyunlix and be like, it's not that serious, it's just the internet, like, log off. And then there's going to be a bunch of people who find this very, very, very important and find ideas like this to be like the most pivotal parts of their lives. And it makes a lot of sense generationally how that happens. They both get leveraged against each other. You know, this one over here is like our direct corollary to why there's this rise of like authoritarianism around how we act on the internet, as well as ideological purity. and ideological purity tests and how that works on the internet. And then this over here is how this perpetuates, right? Like it's not that serious, it's not that important, is the dismissal that allows the actual, like, really antisocial problematic behavior to continue. So that's some of our history. What is the purpose of a disinformation campaign? Why do we do it? What are some of the different parts of it? Because it's more than just lying, right? It is lying for a purpose. It is generating multiple lies. It is a directed lie, and the goal of it is to be continual, right? Like, again, the goal of a disinformation campaign is essentially to rewrite reality. It's essentially to, like, a very successful disinformation campaign results in a complete lack of knowledge of what actually happened or is happening. Oh, there's a dog, and now I'm distracted. That's okay. That's okay. I'm gonna get myself back on track and talk without the dog. This is the problem of not having a script. It's okay. So there is an agenda in place. What was the agenda with the Gamergate? To fucking get women and queer people and people of color out of games, right? It was just to destroy people. And this is something that I think a lot of people have a hard time conceptualizing, and why disinformation campaigns can be so effective is because people really want to say, don't attribute things to malice. And I think that that's, like, often true. I think there's a lot fewer malicious people than it sometimes feels like there is. But the malicious people can be truly malicious. In addition, I think it's difficult to always define purposeful maliciousness. I think it's difficult to identify purposeful maliciousness. It's also really difficult to identify agendas. And sometimes, all of us have agendas, right? Like, I have an agenda here. What's my agenda here? My agenda here is the same agenda I pretty much have with all of my content, which is to motivate people to think critically, educate people on concepts they may not be aware of, and complex concepts, and in doing so, create more pro-social communities that are, like, more resilient and, like, generate more joy overall. That's my agenda. It's a really bad agenda for a disinformation campaign, because that agenda relies on, like, truth and nuance and discussion. If that is my true agenda, I have already failed at this disinformation campaign, because I have told you the truth, right? You now have the opportunity to opt in or opt out of my agenda. But let's say that wasn't the truth, and this is part of how a disinformation campaign works, right? This is one of the aspects, is the sort of espionage aspect. Let's say my agenda is actually somehow a lot, maybe it's a lot less pro-social than that. Maybe my agenda is actually that I want, I mean, it could be, like, literally anything, pretty much. That's a different ideology from what I've already put down. But let's say that, like, what I actually believe is that fandom spaces need to have more, like, singular strong leaders who will police the fandom space most effectively, in a direction that like, I want. Well, this could be effective for that purpose, because part of what you do, and every time people get confused where they're like, I don't understand how, you know, this influencer changed like this, or how this perspective that they're saying is in line with things they've said before, or things like that. Well, very often it's because they never believed those things. a big part of a disinformation campaign is making you endeared to someone, and then that person convincing you to think differently. So I put out all of these ideas and these a very pro-social agenda, and I try to convince you to be endeared towards me, to like me. I'm trying to get the people who I want to change their minds to listen to me and believe in me. And when I feel that I have enough of those people who are very loyal to me, I test that loyalty. I say something that's like suddenly really extreme, that's like really not in line with previous ideologies, but not like so extreme that I know I'm going to lose people, not so extreme that they're going to be like worried about my mental health, just something maybe even irrelevant to what I've talked about before. And I'm just going to test. I'm going to say it, and I'm going to see how many people defend me if I get mobbed from it. I'm going to see if it's even noticeable. If it's not even noticeable, then I can go more extreme. If it is noticeable and people get upset with me, then I apologize. I apologize, and I end up endearing more people to me because I have apologized. I get more fans because I have apologized for this thing. And even though a lot of people are going to be like, no, I'm not going to listen to this person, they obviously have fucked ideas, a lot of people will be like, oh, but they've learned and they've grown. And then I'll back off, right? I now have more people endeared to me, I'll back off a little bit, but I'll keep engaging in that cycle. It's exactly how a coercive control abusive relationship works. It is disinformation campaigns are a form of abuse. And the parts of them are a form of abuse, right? So propaganda is part of a disinformation campaign, but so is having people who will manipulate your ideological opponents to become your ideological friends. That's how people become radicalized. And so anytime you see an influencer where you're like, haven't they apologized like twice for something? Or like, didn't they do that one really fucked up thing one time, but you're saying they're mostly okay, right? Sometimes people do one fucked up thing and they apologize for it and they don't do the fucked up thing again. But always keep a note on the people who keep doing slightly problematic things. Because it is very possible that 2, 3, 4 years down the line, they're going to be doing a lot of problematic things with a much bigger audience who will defend them and now agree with them because they are endeared to them, and we are simply more likely to believe and listen to people who we are endeared towards, who we like, even if it's parasocial relationships, sometimes especially if it's a parasocial relationship, right? The amount of times I have seen people take something that one of the boys said when they were like 21 and be like, wow, what great life advice. And I look at it as a therapist and I'm like, that's fucking terrible life advice. Why are we taking life advice from 21-year-old boys who we don't know? That's not a good idea. Like, this is not life advice you would take from your mother or your friends or your teacher. You're taking it just because of the parasocial relationship that you've built with these guys. So sometimes the online relationship is actually much more effective than the in-person relationship for radicalizing as part of a disinformation campaign. So that's part of it. Propaganda is a part of it. Yellow journalism is a part of it. I'm not going to explain propaganda and yellow journalism. If you don't know what those things are, please go look them up. I'm very sad that you did not get taught that information in your middle school career, because you should have. So propaganda, yellow journalism, individuals who will be willing to manipulate masses, back channels. It helps if the government is on your side in some way. Helps a lot if the state is on your side. Obviously, sometimes cults get involved, or political cults also get involved. So these are some of the big parts of a disinformation campaign. The ultimate goal of a disinformation campaign, though, like I said, is to get people who are not purposefully engaging in a disinformation campaign to be spreading the information, right? You're trying to convince people to believe what you're saying. So it's really common that people will just say, like, oh yeah, Hyunlix are split up by skijigi, because they've read it. Like, somebody has stated it as fact before, so they read it as fact. We are really naive creatures. We're really naive creatures who want to trust other people very often because it is a survival mechanism to trust other people, right? If we don't believe other people, we end up becoming isolated from community, and that is dangerous to survival, even now, and certainly when our brains were evolving. We want to trust other people. We want to believe that when somebody states something as a fact, it's a fact. Because why would they lie? Well, sometimes they lie on purpose, but more often they have been lied to. Hank Green on Vlogbrothers did a video recently about social media and like information on the social media. I think it's really interesting. It's pretty short. It's worth watching. But one of the things he talks about, and this is totally true, is that we don't fact check things that already align with our biases. This is a human thing. And I know some of you are like, well, I do. No, you don't. No, you don't. If somebody says the sky is blue, you do not go and fact check that, right? Because you believe that that's a fact. And like, it is, mostly. Nuancedly, the fact is that the way that we perceive most humans, not all, the fact is that most humans perceive the sky as blue, right? That's the actual fact. But like, in our minds, we're just gonna say the sky is blue. It's a shorthand. But then if somebody says, well, that's not fully true, we're gonna be like, what the fuck are you talking about? Because our bias is that the sky is blue, right? And if somebody says, well, that's like kind of the fact, it's impeding our sense of reality. But it is only kind of the fact. The real fact is that most humans perceive the sky as blue. And some of you are going like, well, that nuance doesn't really matter. But on social media, it does. Because there's a big difference between, well, skijigi could be involved in trying to keep Hyunlix separated, and skijigi doesn't want Hyunlix interacting with each other on camera. Worlds different, universes different between those two things, and how people perceive them. Because if people read the second, and they're used to the internet being reality and being the majority of reality, which for a lot of K-pop fans, a lot of fandoms, the internet is the majority of their reality, because we don't engage with fandom as much in real life, right? Most of us do not have as many fandom friends in real life. It's not as easy to. I mean, fuck, I have 1,100 followers on Threads, many of whom I would consider myself close with internet-wise, right? I don't know 1,100 people in real life. I don't know that many people. I can't know that many people. That is too many people to know. So no, I'm not interacting as much in real life around some of these things as I am on the internet. I already have a wonderful in-person community, right? So I'm really grateful for that. Most of my life is not, I have a large portion of my life on the internet and a large portion of my life not. For a lot of people in fandom spaces, most of their life is on the internet, especially young people, right? Especially people who were still in school during COVID. And I'm really speaking a lot to people like my age on that one, because people my age don't get this, very often. So some of them do. Some of them grew up very isolated or in like more rural areas or things like that. So most of their lives have been on the internet for most of the time. But a lot of people who are, 30, 40 plus don't necessarily understand how much our young Gen Z, Gen Alpha people, like, lives are built on the internet, and the internet is most of their reality. Again, not universally true, but very often the case. So when you see somebody state something as a fact that aligns with some of your biases, so let's say we have a bias that, skijigi, that skiz doesn't get along with skijigi. For whatever reason, let's say that's the bias. That is a whole different nuanced conversation, but let's say that's biased. People, if they hear skijigi is keeping Hyunjin and Felix apart, they're going to be much more likely to believe that as a fact when it's stated as a fact, because it aligns with their interpretation of reality. If their interpretation of reality is that they're like already pretty anti-shipping, and they hear, yeah, Hyunjin and Felix stopped interacting as much because they were really uncomfortable with shippers, they're going to take that as an assumption of reality. It is really hard to look up like what people like Stray Kids have said in the past. We really have to rely on like what people say Stray Kids have said. I am very engaged with this fandom. I've been in this fandom for like 8-9 months at this point. I've seen like 2 episodes of Chan's Room, right? Like, I am a full-grown working adult. I spend almost all of my free time on being a stay, and it is impossible to know swaths of this content and what people have said. So if people in comments are saying like, oh yeah, Hyunlix were uncomfortable with the shipping, the assumption that's going to be made by people, right, there's a world of difference between what people say and what people hear. And a lot of people, what they hear with that is, at some point Hyunjin and Felix have alluded to or said that they were uncomfortable. They're going to assume that, because why would people say that as a fact if there's no fact to be leveraged, right? We just don't believe that people act like that. But then we act like that by believing what just like some person says. So especially if you have a bias like being anti-shipping, you're going to read that and you're going to be like, yes, that aligns with my understanding of reality. And so I'm going to choose to believe that that makes sense, and I'm going to perpetuate that misinformation. And because I'm doing that, I'm going to ignore, I'm not even thinking, it's not even on the table, the idea that maybe the big problem was like ag kais and then hardcore antis like leveraging this situation. That's not even on the table. That's not even an option. We haven't seen that option. Like, it's never occurred that option is a possibility, because it has never been presented as a possibility, right? We're missing the history. This is why historical context is important. We're missing the history. So we only put down on the table the options we know are options. The unknown unknowns are not in our line of sight. We have to actively consider that there are unknown unknowns. People are not taught the skill of how to actively consider that there are unknown unknowns, right? It's very detrimental to governments for people to consider the possibility of unknown unknowns. Critical thinking is very, very detrimental to like the state. In pretty much any state, it actively conflicts with state power. And so people don't get taught these skills unless they're either very lucky or basically unless they're very lucky, right? Like, unless they have some person who's going to help them somehow learn these skills. They're not going to. That's how skills work. Sometimes people you know, go through certain types of trauma when they're young that teach them this possibility if they go through some like post-traumatic growth, right? There's a few different ways that people might like sort of naturally stumble upon this skill, but overall, people are very, very bad at identifying that there may be unknown unknowns. And this is also part of a successful disinformation campaign, right? So even the people who are aware of the whole context, so let's say somebody is aware of the whole context, well, now they're going to assume that everybody's aware of the whole context. And not necessarily on purpose, but it's that little bit of like reverse Dunning-Kruger, wherein like as you start to know more information about something, you assume that other people know the basic information about that. And to them, it's like, well, I stumbled upon this information, so how is it possible that other people haven't? And it's like, well, you kind of got lucky. If it's an effective disinformation campaign and you stumbled across the information instead of actively going after it, you got lucky. I know about the death threats because I was so fascinated by what I was seeing in comments online and in edits. It was very clear to me that like there was something weird happening because there were so many people stating things as facts that there was no way for them to know were facts. And the edits of Hyunlix are much worse in terms of how much they are edited to make something look like it happened that didn't happen than edits in other places. I fully believe that, you know, a lot of Hyunlix editors, they are leveraging the situation for clout. And so they make a lot of edits that make something look like it happened that isn't what happened. I also, frankly, would not be surprised if some of these like shipping accounts were false flags. Like, were people who are part of the disinformation campaign. I don't know that for sure, but I would not be surprised. In fact, I'd be surprised if none of them were. Because again, like that is a fundamental part of a disinformation campaign, is the liars and the manipulators, right? This is the same way that cults work. So we need to get good at looking at edits and going, one, is this edit true? Is what is being said in this edit accurate? And that's not just like turn off the captions, turn off the music, ignore the subtitles and watch and see what you see what is happening. But that's also go back to the original content. The original content and watch it. If you do that, this is how I've learned a lot of stuff about skiz, is that I'll watch an edit and then I'll go to the original content and see what's going on for the context. When you start doing that, you start seeing how much editors lie. Just like straight up bullshit. It's almost deep fake level a lot of times. Hyunlix got a lot more popular as a ship after they stopped interacting as much. And this is actually fine by the people perpetuating this disinformation campaign. This is actually okay by them because they can still make people out to be like perpetrators of harm. That actually gives them more fodder to, you know, make villainize shippers, villainize skiz, like, or not skiz, villainize skijigi. It gives them more access to that. And I know that it's like, okay, this feels like conspiracy brain. I know that it feels like this, but like, again, this is fake. Don't worry about it is part of how disinformation campaigns work. Some conspiracies are true. That's why conspiracy theories are so effective, is because like there actually are conspiracies out there. That is a real thing. And in fandom, it is effective. You want people to believe the things you believe. And people also want to be ignored when they're perpetuators of harm. Any space where people are passionate is a space where people are being exploited. Period. End of story. If there is passion, there is exploitation, because passion is easy to exploit. If you are passionate about something and you are openly passionate about that thing, there are people trying to exploit you. Knowing this is how you protect yourself. Being aware that it is possible there are people trying to exploit you, and that if you don't know somebody, you don't fucking know them. I love my moots on Threads. I love them. I love them with a caveat. I love them with an asterisk. I love them with the asterisk of, I do not know this person. I do not know their agendas for certain. Over time, some of them I've gotten to know better, and I understand them and their agendas a lot better. Because everybody has an agenda. Everybody has an agenda. Even if you don't think that you do, you do. Everybody has an agenda. And that's another thing, is that you need to figure out what your agendas are. That's another way you protect yourself. When you know who you are and what your values are, when you know that, that is protection. Okay? Figure out who you are, what your values are. Because that way, when somebody comes in and hits on those values and tries to slowly break them down, you have more to rely on. And know that there are people trying to break those values down. Like, that's again, some of the goal. People yell in fandom spaces all the time, and what they're yelling about is, like, they have a fundamental value that they feel like other people are breaking, and they want them to engage with that value. Right? That's what's happening. I try to convince people of things too. That's part of, like, life and living. So I love my moots with the caveat that I don't know them. And some of my moots I do not love. To be clear, I have a number of mutuals who I would not necessarily call moots. I have a number of mutuals on Threads who, like, I follow them partially because I really disagree with them. And I think it's useful to have somebody pushing against the things I believe, so that I can sort of determine if I need to change my beliefs or not. I'm sure they've got to disagree with a bunch of stuff I say, because, like, I say a lot of shit that is not in line with the shit they say. I've had people follow me on Threads who I've actively called out for bad behavior before, like, twice. It's bizarre, but, like, that's happened. I don't follow them back, but, like, I have plenty of, like, I acknowledge that at any point, somebody who I'm engaging with in fandom might say something that I go, oh shit, you are not the person I thought you were. So, love each other with asterisks. There should not be unconditional love, especially in fandom space, right? You do not know the politics and values of people in fandom space. People always are like, oh, I'm gonna go to a meetup and make so many friends because we all love Stray Kids. And it's like, no, the love of Stray Kids is not like a uniting force. It's really not. People make assumptions about the idea that their values are going to be shared widely by other people because part of why they love the fandom space is for XYZ reason. So, for instance, there's a lot of people who love the fandom space because they feel it's very queer friendly. And so they just assume that people aren't going to be homophobic. They just assume that people aren't going to be Trump supporters. They just assume XYZ, and then they're shocked to find out that, like, actually, loving Stray Kids has nothing to do with, like, having pro-social opinions. It is not a relevant factor. It may make certain things slightly more likely. There might be certain demographics that exist more within the fandom, but for any one individual, you don't know what they're gonna say until they say it, right? Part of the Hyunlix thing is based in homophobia. I'm not gonna get into that because that's a whole different conversation, but, like, when we look at the goals of disinformation campaigns, they're usually varied. There's usually a number of reasons that they happen. The things that they catalyze are usually based in other things as well. So, you know, it may very well be true that, like, certain types of fan service or certain things, the way that they interacted seemed too authentic and not fan servicey enough, and there are members of staff who were concerned or uncomfortable about that. Sure, that's maybe true, right? It could be based in a number of factors. Absolutely. And again, that's what they're relying on. They're relying on, they put out multiple narratives and see which ones stick. So protect yourself by knowing who you are, what your values are, by being aware that there are people trying to exploit you. Always, 100% of the time. There are people out there, especially on the internet, trying to exploit you. They're trying to exploit your passion. Be aware that there are disinformation campaigns. Notice when there are inconsistencies. If somebody says something to you about like something that happened, yeah, keep it in your mind, and then notice if, like, go and figure out if there are other people saying other things. Read the entire comments thread of a comments section sometimes. When you have the bandwidth to do it, if you see information that's new information, read the rest of the comments. When you watch old content, read the comments on that old content. See what was actually going on then. Yeah, so that's been my hour and 15 minutes on disinformation campaigns. I hope you enjoyed. Sorry I yapped for so long. I guess if you want to listen to my podcast, it's called Stray Kids the Megaverse, and it is analyzing the overall entertainment of the not just the music or the lore, but the meta that Stray Kids exists in. You can find it basically anywhere except Apple Podcasts, because Apple Podcasts doesn't like you trying to do things if you're not an Apple user. I have a couple of videos on YouTube, which I think is where I'm going to upload this to, analyzing from a clinical perspective Railway, and then reacting to Hollow, and I'm going to be doing a little bit more of those. If you'd like to support me and my work, you can check out my Supercast, which is like Patreon but more focused on podcasters who sometimes also do YouTube. I would appreciate it. Part of the reason that this is not going to have a transcription is because I am a therapist and don't make much money, and I can't really afford massive transcriptions for as much as I talk. So that's like one of my first goals with any money from a Supercast, which I have not done a good job of advertising, but I didn't do my nails. That's okay. Love you. Stay safe, stay sane, stay healthy, whatever, etc. Mwah.